January 17th, 2025, and this video is called, "Of Course They Lied About the Fukushima Fallout Conspiracy. The cover-up was real." Now, it's finally come out, and this bulletin of the atomic scientists, this is a fascinating article because it shows about the concealment from the public. This article investigates the aftermath of the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear disaster concerning radioactive contamination in Tokyo. Before I get to that, the population of Tokyo at the time in 2011 was 13 million people. So there could have been, or actually there were 13 million people exposed to this radiation. Now, this is the article. I'll give you a little summary of it, but I would suggest that you read this actually twice because it's kind of hard to follow with all the names and the characters. But there'll be a link in the description so you could check this out yourself. But this is the total cover-up. Here's the map of this plume. And this contaminated a large swath. Actually, the breadbasket of Japan was kind of ruined. Now, this is the most interesting part, that there were actually people doing filters, air filters. And look at this. 7 o'clock in the morning, you got this contamination. But the peak of it, look at this, was 300 CPMs of cesium. At 10 to 11 o'clock was the worst time that the plume came over the city. In Tokyo, there's over 10,000 CPMs. I mean, it goes on about how they held back the reports and the findings. And this is the first, look at this electron microscope. This is the radioactive cesium microparticles right here. Look at this stuff. If this stuff gets, which it did get lodged into their lungs, that this causes cancer. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you this little summary of it. These are the people that were involved in it. Shocking results. So check this out. So what the background is that after the nuclear disaster in 2011, radioactive plumes reached Tokyo, leading to the deposition of radioactive particles. The article details how the extent of the contamination was not fully disclosed to the public. It highlights that researchers from the Tokyo Metropolitan Industrial Technology Research Institute initially measured radiation in Tokyo's air, but the full implications of these findings were not communicated transparently. That's the cover-up. The first publication that they put out was in June of 2011. They estimated relatively low radiation doses, suggesting minimal public health risk. However, later research by Satoshi Utsunomiya revealed the presence of highly radioactive cesium microparticles in the air, particularly on March 15th. It would pose a significant health risk if inhaled due to their size and radioactivity. The article discusses how Satoshi, their research on the cesium microparticles, was delayed in publication due to its potential to cause public harm. His findings contradicted earlier statements that downplayed the health implications of Tokyo's radiation exposure. There was a significant delay in sharing research data, with some studies only being published years after the initial data collection. So the public implications of health are that the presence of these microparticles could imply a higher exposure risk than previously acknowledged, especially considering their potential to lodge in human lungs. The lack of public disclosure led to the situation where residents might not have taken necessary precautions against the radiation exposure. How dirty is that? So in the piece, this Diaz Morin's piece is an example of investigative science journalism aiming to uncover how scientific data was managed during a crisis, reflecting on the balance between public safety information and causing unnecessary panic. The article essentially critiques the handling of scientific information post-Fukushima, highlighting issues of transparency, public health, and the relationship between science communication and public policy. Now, the right over here, this was interesting. This article was written in 2013. It states that on the 14th, the easterly winds, which had been blowing the highly radioactive gases and aerosols coming from Fukushima out to sea, they shifted and pushed the radioactive plume back over the Japanese mainland. You could see the progression. The red indicates the radioactive plume. Note that the images indicate that the plume first went over south of Tokyo and then reversed and went north as the wind changed. All the areas where the radioactive gases passed over were contaminated. However, the heaviest contamination occurred where the rainfall was occurring and the radiation rained out. This accounts for a patchy deposition of the radioactive fallout. This is Tokyo right here. Now, 8 months after the disaster, the Japanese Science Ministry released this map, which shows that 1,100 square miles, which is 30,000 square kilometers, which represents 13% of the Japanese mainland, had been contaminated with long-lived radioactive cesium. So note that the official map does not note any cesium-137 contamination on the metropolitan area, unlike the unofficial survey done at the same time by Professor Yukiya Hayakawa of Guma University. Given the fact that the Japanese government and TEPCO denied for 2 months that any meltdowns actually had even occurred, one must look at all official data with a healthy degree of skepticism. Now, the area contaminated is the size of Connecticut. So we were lied to. The Japanese people were lied to. The health consequences are enormous. And this is just one cover-up. There's cover-ups on the thyroid cancer. So who knows all the health effects that happen to us. Not only in Japan, but in the United States, all over the world. That plume was circling the earth for like 2 months. So we're going on 13, 14 years after this has happened already. So you know now why when I say nuclear, I spell it nuclear. It's just so weird that that word contains that saying, nuclear, because they don't want us to know the truth, how poisonous, carcinogenic, and expensive nuclear power is. They create these death machines that spew carcinogenic materials that pollute the world. And they want to call it our new green savior. Give me a break. So know another thing. For the people that say, oh, not one person got cancer from Fukushima, no one ever died, we will never know the answer to these questions. This stuff is radioactive. It's invisible. You cannot see this with the human eye. So we have no idea or comprehension what the health effects of this stuff are. And it doesn't make you better. It makes you ill. So for these people to say no one was hurt from Fukushima, they're full of shit.
Hi, I'm Arnie Gunderson from Fairwinds, and it's Tuesday, July 19th. Today I plan to talk about the condition of the reactors at Fukushima, and more importantly, the radiation that's been detected throughout Japan, not just on the site. And finally, I want to talk about a condition that the Japanese are beginning to call black rain. Well, the first thing is the condition of the site itself. All three Fukushima reactors that were running, 1, 2, and 3, and the fuel pool on Unit 4 continue to release radiation. Now, you don't see it in the day because the days are warm now, but you do see it at night. And I've gotten many, many emails about this where people think that the site is blowing up. In fact, it's steam coming out of these reactors and hitting cold air from the Pacific. So they continue to release radiation. But most of the radiation from Fukushima was released in March and in April. At this point, there's a lot less radiation every day than there was in March and April. About 90 to 95% of the radiation from Fukushima was released in the first 6 weeks of the accident. While it continues to release radiation, there's nowhere near as much on a daily basis. On the other hand, Fukushima may be continuing to release radiation for a long time. As a matter of fact, the Japanese announced that it's going to be 10 years before they begin to remove those cores from the bottom of the containment. There's no technology right now to remove them. Remember, they've melted through the nuclear reactor and they're lying on the floor of the nuclear containment. And now at 3 Mile Island, they had melted onto the bottom of the reactor, but not through the reactor. So this is brand new. And you know, it's sort of like trying to peel an egg off the bottom of a frying pan. If it's cooked too long, it's a very, very complicated and difficult process. In my mind, the more concerning thing is the information that's been coming in from off-site lately. Some friends of mine are biologists that had worked at Chernobyl and went to Japan to do some scientific work over there. They went anticipating things were going to be bad. I got a call this week from them and they said, you know, things are really, really bad. So these are hardened scientists who are used to dealing with radiation, and they believe that conditions at Fukushima are much worse than they had thought. Now, there's some corroborating evidence that's come in on that. The first is that mushrooms about 30 miles from the reactor, between 30 and 40 miles from the reactor, are found to be contaminated well in excess of what the Japanese are allowing. Now, the interesting part of that is that the mushrooms were grown indoors. So how can a mushroom grown indoors exceed the radiation standards that the Japanese have set? It's a major concern, and again, it's 35 miles from the accident. Now, this is cesium. It's got a 30-year half-life, but 30 years from now, it's still going to be disintegrating at 250,000 disintegrations per second. And 30 years after that, at 125,000 disintegrations per second. That's what this term half-life means. Now, this occurred out at 45 miles. You'll recall the Nuclear Regulatory Commission suggested evacuation out beyond 50 miles, and this appears to indicate that the NRC was right. The Japanese should have evacuated their population out beyond 50 miles and instead stopped at around 12 to 18 miles. Now, this contamination then has spread beyond the Fukushima prefecture, yet the prefecture itself seems to be the only place that the Japanese are worried about this radioactive exposure. The last thing I'd like to talk about today is what happens outside the 50 miles that we've just been talking about. It's already pretty clear based on the radiation in the straw that we discovered that the radiation, even out as far as 50 miles, is as high in some areas as Chernobyl was. Well, what about further? Let's take a look at Tokyo, and I'm concerned there too. First, the sewage treatment plants in Tokyo have contaminated their sewage sludge. Now, normally that material is used in building construction material, but it's so radioactive it has to be stored outside under tarps until someone can figure out a way to get rid of it. The second thing is, a Japanese gentleman sent me a lab report. This person took it into their own hands to pay for a lab to analyze data on the street near a playground in Tokyo. Here's the lab report. It shows that there's 53,000 disintegrations per second in a kilogram, about 2.2 pounds of material on the side of a street near a playground in Tokyo. Now, this person was so concerned that they went to the mayor of that town, and the mayor said, "I'm not worried about it." Here's a citizen with his own money, paid for a lab report, and could get nowhere with his local government. Well, there's another piece of data, and that comes out of the National Cancer Center Hospital near Tokyo as well. It's been on their website since a couple days after the accident. The report shows that on March 24th, that's 9 days after the accident, the radioactive background outside the hospital was 30 times higher than the radioactive background inside the hospital. There was deposition of hot particles on the soil, and it was significant enough to increase the amount of radiation that the detectors were picking up by a factor of 30. Now, a National Cancer Hospital clearly knows how to measure radiation, so these are experienced scientists. Clouds of radioactive particles, hot particles, depositing everywhere in northern Japan. Well, the Japanese are resourceful people, and as evidenced by their World Cup win on Sunday. But they need to know the magnitude of the problem they're facing in order to handle it correctly. Rather than limit the information, it's important that they limit the radiation.